Ukrainian SBU put Igor Kirillov, the head of the Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Weapons Division in the Defense Ministry. He was murdered on December 16th by a terrorist attack, a bomb detonated from, I believe, a scooter outside of a residential building in Moscow. Vladimir Putin and Andrei Belousov met with the entirety of the defense ministry on December 16th. And Putin had this to say, and I wanted to play this before I get your comments. He talked about pushing red lines, and here is his warning. I'm just going to play about a minute of this.
We see that the current administration of the United States and practically the entire collective West do not abandon their attempts to maintain their global dominance. They continue to impose their so-called rules on the world community, which they change time and again, distorting them as it suits them. Well, strictly speaking, they have only one stable rule: no rules for those who do this. For those who consider themselves at the head of the whole world, for those who consider themselves representatives of God on earth, although they themselves do not fear God. And against unwanted states they wage hybrid wars, implement a policy of containment, including with respect to Russia, in an effort to weaken our country, to inflict a strategic defeat on us. The United States continues to pump the de facto illegitimate ruling regime in Kiev with weapons and money. They send mercenaries and military advisors, and thus they encourage further escalation of the conflict. At the same time, under the pretext of a mythical Russian threat, they simply frighten their population by saying that we are going to attack someone, because their tactics are very simple. They bring us to the red line, across which we can no longer retreat. We begin to respond to them, and they immediately frighten their population with the former Soviet and now Russian threat.
So, Ben, I wanted to play that because at the same time that they were meeting with the defense ministry, Vladimir Putin, Andrei Belousov, talking about preparing for war with NATO and pushing red lines, we had this attack. So, your thoughts and your comments on where this attack fits into this broader, it seems like buildup and escalation that we've been seeing entering into Trump 2.0.
Yeah, well, it's more of the same. I mean, it's clear that Ukraine has lost this war, and as they have lost, they've become more and more desperate and have engaged in these kinds of attacks where they're just killing top-level officials in Russia. And of course, if Ukraine did this, it was with the support of the. Well, they said that they did this, and when they do these kinds of things, they do so with the support of the United States. Ukraine does not make these kinds of important decisions without getting approval from Washington. We've seen this again and again, where every month or two, they keep moving further and further up the escalation ladder, and they have to ask for approval from the White House. And so, for instance, before this, the latest escalation was that Ukraine is now using long-range missiles that were provided by the US in order to strike deep into Russian territory. But again, I mean, they've lost this war. If you read mainstream Western media outlets, they're finally acknowledging that Ukraine, that is NATO, has lost. So before it's inevitable that this war has to come to an end, they continue to kill Russian officials, trying to pressure Russia to essentially give them what NATO wants, which Russia is not going to accept. I mean, we can hear that very clearly in Putin's speech there. And that's an important speech also because he's putting the context of the war in a much larger overall situation, which is not just about Ukraine. It's about the US-led West truly thinks that it rules the entire world. They talk about their so-called rules-based international order in which they make the rules. They order everyone around. As he said, they think that they're the gods of the world. When he said those comments, it reminded me of American exceptionalism and how every US president says, we are the greatest country in history ever created. I mean, that is a kind of religious view that we are the best thing ever in human history and no one can be better than us. And that is such a common view. In fact, if you're a politician in the US and you don't say that, you're attacked as a traitor because you're not this extreme supremacist, I mean, who sees yourself truly as the God on earth. So I personally, I know that there are a lot of people who always like to say, oh, there's so much more escalation, it's going to be World War III. And I actually don't think at that point, I think there were several moments in the past 2 years that were very dangerous. And fortunately, we did not go into World War III, which would be disastrous. I think ultimately these are signs of Ukrainian desperation and by extension, NATO desperation.
This gentleman, Igor Kirillov, he is one who was just targeted by Ukraine itself, accused of chemical warfare on the battlefront, accused of facilitating it. Russia denies this. But one thing we do know about Mr. Kirillov is that he was deeply open about the preparations Ukraine was making with NATO help around using and utilizing chemical warfare, biological warfare, particularly through earlier in the conflict, these biolabs, etc. Could you talk about that and even just this use of this kind of terrorism and what it says about Ukraine and NATO? You said that World War III isn't right around the corner. And at the same time, it feels like there is this attempt to keep the escalations going and to keep this conflict going.
Well, yeah, because they lost. I mean, it's so funny. You read Politico, which is basically the voice of the U.S. government. And Politico has published multiple articles saying Ukraine lost. This has been acknowledged by many mainstream media outlets in the West. So when you have lost in a war like this, you can either just surrender and then give the other side all of what they demand, or you can just lash out and engage in these extreme acts of provocation and just terrorism, assassinating top government officials, military commanders. That's what they're doing because they can't actually win the war. So while, for instance, in Ukraine, they're under U.S. pressure. They're changing the policy to now to push 18-year-olds into the meat grinder of war. For people who don't know what I'm referring to, Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, publicly revealed after a series of reports that he has been pressuring Ukraine to reduce the age of conscription down to 18. Because previously, Ukraine was saying, well, we don't want to destroy our entire generation of the youth. So instead, the average age of people was in the 40s on the front line, the Ukrainian fighters. Now they're conscripting 18-year-olds and people in their early 20s. So clearly, again, this is a sign of desperation that they've clearly lost. So what they can do is continue to carry out acts of terror, targeted assassinations against top Russian officials, because they think that this could be a way to try to maximize their leverage. At this point, when you're losing a war, you have to think about ways that the war will end. Realistically, they're not going to defeat Russia. NATO has lost. So their goal is to cause as much damage as they can to the Russian government, to Russian leadership. The EU just announced another package of sanctions against Russia. This is the 15th package. I mean, what are they going to? They're going to sanction the last bread, the bread like a bakery or whatever, or grocery store that they haven't sanctioned. I mean, it's like a joke at this point. They're just trying to find new things to sanction because, as they often boast, Russia is now the most sanctioned country on earth. So they're just trying to keep pushing the pressure because they know at some point very soon they're going to have to come to the negotiating table and come to some kind of agreement. Now, what that agreement looks like, I think, is still very much in the air. I honestly do not see some kind of formal agreement likely. I think what's more likely is the Korea War situation, where they essentially freeze the conflict and there's a de facto recognition that the Donbass is part of Russia. And there's a de facto recognition that Ukraine will not be in NATO. But I mean, do you really think? I don't think that Europe would be willing to sign any agreement like that. And now with Trump coming in, it's impossible to predict. Trump said not only did he claim during the campaign that he would end it, he actually claimed that even before he became president, that the war would end. Well, that's looking like it's not going to happen. And then he said he would do it on day one. That's not going to happen either. And a lot of the people around Trump are very hawkish, especially Marco Rubio, who will be the head of the State Department. And of course, most of the people in Trump's cabinet that he has nominated so far are extreme anti-China hawks. But Rubio is also very anti-Russia. Right. And Trump's national security advisor pick, Mike Waltz, who will likely be nominated as well. He's not seen as a controversial pick. Mike Waltz is a neocon. He's also very anti-Russia. So I don't see this. I don't see this scenario in which the U.S. pressures Europe to just sign some kind of agreement. I think it's more likely that this is drawn out a little bit more, and then eventually they come to some kind of Korean War situation where the war is frozen, and the reality on the ground is unofficially recognized, but it doesn't become official. And that's why, I mean, how many months does Ukraine have left? Well, we're at the end of December almost. 1 month until Trump comes in. And then when Trump comes in, again, it's not going to happen immediately, but let's say it's a few months. So I honestly think that this is just, again, part of this desperation in the last months of the conflict.
Well, it's interesting you talk about conflict freeze, because now we do, as you say, we have Trump coming in, Trump administration number 2 coming in. And Donald Trump made recent comments in his first press conference since being elected, where he said something to the effect of, this is a real nasty one, but we're going to make a little progress, at least a little progress toward ending the conflict. And that's what he is supposedly going to be committed to. But it's interesting that you talk about the freeze, because on the one hand, the United States appears to be, at least Donald Trump appears to be interested in a freeze. But at this defense ministry meeting, where the conclusion for Russia was that they were going to actually be preparing for war for the next 10 years. That is what Belousov said. He said, the Ministry of Defense of Russia must be ready for any development of events, including possible military conflict with NATO in Europe in the next decade. That's a direct quote. But then even Reuters is citing the fact that Belousov is saying that they are taking 30 square kilometers a day, Russia is, and they have actually taken more territory in 2024 than at any prior time in the conflict. So I'm curious, Ben, what do you think about this idea that if there is going to be negotiations, that it's likely going to be on Russia's terms, given how Russia is even just talking about the future of this conflict?
There's no question. I mean, what does the US and the EU and NATO have to offer? I mean, the only thing they have to offer is removing sanctions. That's really it. And so all of the leverage is on Russia's side. And from Russia's perspective, they also say, okay, you should lift the sanctions anyway because they violate international law. We're not going to, this. I know we're going to talk about Syria later. This is exactly what the U.S. strategy was in Syria. We are suffocating you with sanctions. Now you should do what we want, and then we'll take off the sanctions. Well, no, you have to take off the sanctions according to international law. You can't just wage economic war against every country, although that's what the U.S. wants to do, and that's what the U.S. does. And this is the rules-based international order in which the U.S. makes the rules and orders everyone around. And 1/3 of countries on earth are sanctioned by the U.S. But anyway, getting back to the specific case of Russia, it's also, when we look at the sanctions, they, of course, have done damage to Russia, but they've also caused, ironically, some positive side effects. So now Russia's economy is growing faster than any European economy. While Germany's in recession, the UK is in recession, Russia is growing very healthily, and it's reindustrializing. You're seeing a revival of some of these formerly deindustrialized areas. In fact, the FT published a very interesting article about these kinds of Rust Belt areas in Russia. Like, people know of the Rust Belt in the US. These were the major manufacturing areas in, the Midwest and places like Cleveland, Ohio, and Detroit, that previously were centers of industry and the car companies. And in the neoliberal era, many of those jobs were taken offshore. They were deindustrialized. Well, similarly, during the Soviet Union, there were parts of rural Russia that were major manufacturing hubs, and they had local factories where people worked. And then with the imposition of neoliberal shock therapy in the 90s and the overthrow of the Soviet Union, a lot of these areas were just turned into the Russian Rust Belt. A lot of people left. There was brain drain. There were a few jobs locally. There was poverty, unemployment. Well, now what we're seeing is actually a revival of some of these local areas. In fact, some of the Western, to the extent that there were some factories in Russia that were managed by Western companies or car companies, for instance, in the case of Japan, which also left, Russia has taken over these factories and is now making Russian cars and other Russian manufacturing goods. So this is, again, I mean, it has caused damage to the Russian economy, but this has also encouraged Russia to reindustrialize, to become more self-sufficient, and to deepen its economic integration with China, with India, with Eurasia in general. Russia is making it very clear that its future lies in further integration with Asia and not with the West. So from Russia's perspective, what do they get from negotiating with the West? The only thing they have to offer is lifting sanctions, which, as I just discussed, have actually not been as damaging to Russia as a lot of people in the West want to think. So I think what we're actually seeing here is Russia is too big to sanction, right? This is the logical conclusion, that when the US has just tried to sanction everyone around the world, eventually what it does is it actually creates kind of new economic blocks that now Russia is firmly part of, this larger Eurasian bloc. So, I mean, obviously, I'm not a military expert. I don't know exactly what the military strategy is going to be, but simply looking at it from a geopolitical perspective and an economic perspective, Russia at this point is obviously winning. The fact that they're taking 30 square kilometers a day is a sign of that. So all the momentum is on their side, which means that NATO, Ukraine, the US, and the EU, they can see that the days are numbered. That's why they're engaged in these very provocative dangerous acts, terrorist acts, because they know that they only have a few months left. So they're trying to maximize the very little leverage they have while still cognizant of the fact that they lost and really have nothing to offer Russia.
You know, Ben, some in the geopolitical space, people who are following geopolitics get disappointed when they hear Vladimir Putin and Russia make warnings, talk about pushing red lines. They say, well, Russia is just bluffing. Russia's not going to do anything about this. And I'm curious on your perspectives on this, given what you just said, that Russia is winning right now and the scales seem to be tipped in favor of Russia. So I'm curious on what you think about this perspective that I've heard so many. I get messages about this, and I've seen this argument and debate take place a lot for those following this conflict, and mainly in the collective West. Your view?
Well, a few things. So you mentioned that quote earlier from Russian military leadership. I mean, these kinds of vague comments are made by basically every military commander in every major country. We see similar comments in China where they're saying we must prepare for potential war in the future. I mean, this is the goal of a military, right? Is that they need to be prepared for future conflict. Meanwhile, you see these insane U.S. generals in the U.S. who are saying that we are going to have war with China by 2025. So, I mean, you have these, the Western media loves to take comments like this from Russian military commanders or Chinese, and they portray this as evidence that supposedly Russia or China are preparing for war in the West. Russia and China do not want to expand war further. They want to focus on economic development. They want to focus on being more self-sufficient and not being as dependent on the West. And in that sense, again, the sanctions have actually helped them decrease their dependency on the West. In the case of China, for instance, I was just looking at recent data. Just a decade ago, China's exports to the U.S. were around 7-8% of GDP. Now China's exports to the U.S. are 2% of GDP and declining over time. So the situation just in one decade has changed a lot. And as for, you know, the possibility of NATO entering, I know there are a lot of people who say this because it sounds very interesting and everyone, I mean, there's always this urge to portray the world as being on the verge of chaos and collapse. But we should think about this realistically. There's no way that the U.S. is going to send, I mean, the U.S. has a few special operations forces and CIA agents on the ground in Ukraine, but the U.S. is not going to send tens of thousands of troops to Ukraine to fight a war against Russia. That would be World War III. It's not going to happen. Now, will some European countries that are members of NATO actually send more troops? Again, they do have a small number of special operations forces, and they've been there from the very beginning. But let's think about this for a second. First of all, who would do that? Okay, let's say, is Germany going to send troops? Well, first of all, the German government right now is on the verge of collapse. It's not going to do anything. Is France? The French government is on the verge of collapse. Macron is not going to do anything like that. The UK, I mean, that's a joke. It's so funny seeing the UK act as though it's a serious military power. I mean, no one in the world is afraid of the British military. The British military is extremely, it's not well trained at all. It has no discipline. It's not going to fight against Russia in Ukraine. Give me a break. This is all bluster. It's all part of the strategy to try to threaten Russia, to try to pressure Russia to reduce its demands for negotiations, because everyone can see that Ukraine has lost. In NATO, there are really only two militaries that are significant, the US and Turkey. Turkey's certainly not going to send troops to Ukraine. They're focused on capturing the north of Syria right now.
They're about to invade. Anyway.
The only country in NATO that actually could have the military capacity to fight against Russia is the US. And they're not going to do that for a variety of reasons. Also because they're much more focused on China at this point. So I think, again, this is all part of a larger strategy. The media wants everyone to be afraid that there's going to be, and NATO is going to enter in Ukraine and is going to fight back and beat back the Russians. It's nonsense. It's childish. It's not going to happen. All of this is part of this propaganda campaign that is trying to obfuscate the fact that Ukraine and NATO have lost. I mean, they have completely lost. It's really obvious that Russia is winning, and all of the momentum is on Russia's side. And because they refuse to acknowledge that, they're just, again, I keep repeating myself, but they're trying to find leverage that they can use against Russia. And the only leverage they have left is just killing top Russian officials and putting the 15th round of sanctions on Russia, as if that's going to change anything.
In our lead story today, we turn to the snow-covered streets of Moscow, where the dust has only just settled after a bomb blast with global implications. On Thursday, the 17th of December, an attempt on the life of a prominent Russian general succeeded just as it was drawn up in a major act of retribution by the very same nation that Russia has spent years trying to conquer. The target was Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov, age 54 years at the time of his death. Hailing from the Russian city of Kostroma, this boy, Kirillov has been a career military man since the waning days of the Soviet Union, and ever since he got his start, he's had one singular focus: weapons of mass destruction. From his 1991 graduation from Russia's School of Chemical Defense to years as a commander for forces dealing with radiological, biological, and chemical weapons to a lead role at Russia's military academy to deal with WMDs, Kirillov's entire life has centered around humanity's most devastating weapons, and since 2017, he's held the most important WMD job of all. In his 7 years as head of the troops of radiological, chemical, and biological defense of the Russian armed forces, Kirillov has overseen the care of Russia's WMD arsenal, helped to develop a particularly nasty thermobaric warhead rocket launcher, tried to discredit reports of chemical weapons used by Syria's recently deposed Bashar al-Assad, and more. But the thing that he's done that's most relevant to our story today is that he's also played a significant role in the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. During the war, he's done everything from launching thoroughly debunked accusations that the US and Ukraine were collaborating on secret laboratories to build bioweapons, to accusing Ukraine of building a radiological weapon, also known as a dirty bomb, to overseeing the use of chemical weapons, including the agent chloropicrin on the battlefield. But on the morning of Tuesday the 17th, the life of Lieutenant General Kirillov came to a sudden and inauspicious end. In the early hours of the day, Kirillov and his assistant, identified by Russian state media as Ilya P., had just left a residential complex where Kirillov may maintain a residence of his own or may have been visiting. In footage circulated by the SBU, the Ukrainian security services, from the time of the incident, Kirillov and his assistant can be seen leaving the residence and stepping out to a waiting car where a driver would take Kirillov to work for the day. As they cross toward the car, an explosion takes place, with that explosion sending shrapnel in all directions and shaking nearby buildings, per Russian state media. Photos circulated on Telegram then show two bodies at the scene, lying prone in the snow, including one that has since been identified as Kirillov. According to Russian outlets, the attack used between 100 and 300 grams of TNT packed into a bomb that was concealed in turn outside an electric scooter. Russian authorities, including former President Dmitry Medvedev, were quick to blame Ukraine, levying allegations that its smaller adversary nation certainly could have tried to deny, but didn't. Instead, unnamed Ukrainian sources quite happily gave early indication to Western media that their nation was responsible, and in particular, the SBU intelligence service. Said one Ukrainian intelligence official with direct knowledge of the killing, speaking with the Financial Times, quoting here, "Kirillov was a war criminal and a completely legitimate target, as he gave orders to use banned chemical weapons against the Ukrainian military. Such an inglorious end awaits all who kill Ukrainians. Retribution for war crimes is inevitable." Indeed, the SBU's attempts to establish the legitimacy of a potential killing of Kirillov had already been underway, culminating in a particularly interesting act on the day before his death. On Monday the 16th, the SBU had issued a warrant for Kirillov, referred to in Ukraine as a, quote, notice of suspicion for war crimes committed against the forces of Kyiv. In hindsight, of course, the meaning of that warrant is absolutely crystal clear. Ukraine issued the notice against Kirillov, and just one day later, in the heart of the Russian Federation, they came to collect. In their official statement on Kirillov's death, the SBU noted that Kirillov was, quote, responsible for the mass use of banned chemical weapons by the Russians against the defense forces on the eastern and southern fronts of Ukraine, including, quote, more than 4,800 cases of the enemy's use of chemical munitions since the beginning of the full-scale war. Russian officials, of course, framed the assassination oh so differently, with former President Medvedev referring to Kirillov as a, quote, true patriot of Russia, and threatening that, quote, vengeance awaits the senior military political leadership of Ukraine. The spokesperson of Russia's foreign ministry said of the attack that Kirillov had spent, quote, many years exposing the crimes of the Anglo-Saxons, and that, quote, he worked fearlessly. He didn't hide behind anyone's back. He met everything head on. Internationally, the allegations that Kirillov oversaw the use of chemical weapons has garnered broad support. Several nations, including Canada and the United Kingdom, have subjected Kirillov to sanctions, while this past May, the US State Department sanctioned Russia for using the chemical weapon chloropicrin against Ukrainian forces. Ukraine has long alleged the use of chemical weapons in over 1,000 cases, although third-party confirmation had been lacking until that May statement by the United States. To be clear, chloropicrin isn't nearly the most lethal agent in Russia's chemical weapons stores. It's not never lethal, but it's best thought of as a riot control agent or a similarly less lethal tool to deny a certain area to an adversary. Set off a bunch of chloropicrin along, say, a Ukrainian trench line, and that trench will very quickly have to be abandoned. But the conventions around chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons don't discriminate between WMDs on the basis of lethality, and although this does present a real grey area where the term weapon of mass destruction makes a bit less sense for a layperson, it's precisely this grey area that the Russian military appear to want to exploit. It's a chemical weapons version of the same broad pattern of pushing boundaries that Russia under Vladimir Putin has become so known for. Use chloropicrin a few times and see what the international backlash is. If it's not too severe, then maybe use something a little bit more lethal, and if the world gets angrier about that new use instance, well, you could say, obviously you're targeting my country when it's convenient for you, but you approved of my use of chloropicrin, and this is no different. That's why the international community has taken such pains to push back on chloropicrin and against Kirillov himself to try and set an international standard that chemical weapons will not be tolerated during Russia's Ukraine offensive. Now, with the targeted assassination of Kirillov, Ukraine has done two things at once: forcing a broader conversation about the use of chemical weapons in Ukraine, and raising the stakes for punishment of Russia after deploying those weapons by killing the very same leader who allegedly oversaw their use. Beyond raising awareness around the Putin regime's continued use of chemical weapons, the assassination has also raised the profile of Ukraine's broader campaign of targeting killings against key Russian figures. Ukraine has claimed responsibility for a small handful of targeted assassinations, but it's believed to have carried out significantly more than just that. Take the August 2022 assassination of Darya Dugina, daughter of the longtime Putin supporter and pro-invasion political philosopher Alexander Dugin, in a car bombing. Or take the death of prominent Russian mill blogger Maxim Fomin, writing under the name Vlad and Tatarsky, in a bomb attack in a cafe in St. Petersburg. Or there was the prominent Russian submarine captain Stanislav Rozhitsky, killed after probably being tracked because he shared his jogging routes on an app called Strava. Or the killing of Colonel Dmitry Golenkov, a Russian Air Force leader who was accused of orchestrating an attack on a Ukrainian shopping center and found bludgeoned to death in the Russian city of Bryansk. Just a few days before Kirillov's killing in Moscow, the former head of a notorious prison in Donetsk Oblast in occupied Ukraine was killed by a car bomb planted under his personal vehicle. That former warden, Sergei Yevsyukov, was accused of overseeing a missile strike on his own prison that killed dozens of Ukrainian POWs and allegedly obliterated evidence of the use of torture against them. Several car bombs and other targeted assassinations in occupied Ukraine have been catalogued just this year. It's a seemingly tried-and-true method for Ukrainian intelligence, an organization that can likely draw support from a large number of fluent Russian speakers, a wealth of anti-war or pro-opposition disillusioned people within Russia itself, and covert networks of continued resistance to occupation in the Donbass, Crimea, and elsewhere. For Ukraine, lacking the ability to launch effective large-scale attacks against Russia or reliably strike with missiles against critical targets deep on Russian territory, the campaign of assassination is a way to offset the pressure of Russian battlefield successes and advantages in hardware and numbers. Not only that, but they are a valuable mechanism by which Ukraine can advance a more general goal of its wartime operations, bringing the costs of Russian war home to the Russian people. Ukraine's efforts to that end have included the use of drone and missile strikes in Russia, the counter-invasion of a portion of Russia's Kursk Oblast, and a wide range of explained and unexplained acts of apparent sabotage all across the Russian heartland. And right now, for Ukraine, any counter-pressure against the Russian war effort is desperately needed. 3 days prior to the assassination of Kirillov, Ukraine replaced its military commander overseeing defenses in the most tightly contested parts of the Donbass region. This is where Russian troops are swiftly advancing on the Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk. The battle to defend Pokrovsk has been a horrifically attritional affair for Ukraine, and it's been increasingly faltering against the crush of Russia's westward offensive. The fall of Pokrovsk would precipitate major territorial losses for Ukraine at the very moment when both sides are trying to scrape together whatever territory they can in advance of a likely US-brokered peace settlement. Meanwhile, fighting is ongoing in Kursk, where Russia is working to recapture all of the territory that Ukraine currently controls. That's the area where North Korean troops have begun showing up on the front lines, with an American Major General Pentagon spokesman Pat Ryder reporting on Monday, the 16th, that North Koreans are now engaged in combat and taking casualties. The day prior, Ukraine had confirmed some 30 North Korean casualties in Kursk thus far. In a moment when pressure is ramping up on Ukraine and Russia is burning through ammunition, committing troops, calling in international favors and more, Ukraine's successful assassination of Kirillov appears to do two things. First, it's another signal that Ukraine can and will bring the cost of war home to Russia, including by targeting a particularly notorious leader in the bastion and capital city of Moscow. Second, it's an attempt to impose the sorts of losses that might have some small chance of forcing Russia to change its calculus, either by taking steps to protect military leaders in a similar position to Kirillov, or being pressured by those same leaders who might not want to stick out their own necks in the way that stick out the necks of their troops. But whether Ukraine will be able to achieve either goal in practice, that's another question entirely. And while the assassination of Kirillov is certainly a wartime and morale victory for Ukrainian intelligence, there is little indication that it could help to turn the tide. If anything, it may yet serve as pretext for Russia to devote more material, more manpower, and more attention to critical military or even civilian targets in the name of retribution. It's a new world in Syria right now, and after the week or so that it took global onlookers to pick our collective jaw up off the floor, the nations of the world are making their first tentative approach toward a country no longer ruled by Bashar al-Assad. From hesitant but hopeful overtures from the Western world to discouraged attempts from Iran, Russia, and others to recoup the value they can from what's been lost, the process of global reintegration is now fully underway, even as news of the stunning abuses of the Assad regime continue to come to light. Now, before we get into the meat of what's going on in Syria, we should put into perspective exactly what's going on here, because it has been a very long time since the world got to engage in a diplomatic effort of this scale. Try to think back to the last time that a regime fell during a fundamentally internal conflict and wasn't replaced by either a system of military rule or high-ranking insiders pulling off a palace coup, or an established political or civil alternative with a nationwide presence. Not only did Syria's longtime regime fall, but the people trying to replace it now lack any level of nationwide civil or administrative infrastructure, and at the same time they've turned their backs on the nations that propped up the regime that preceded them. Put simply, this is a very interesting experiment in what will either be remembered as nation building or a failure of international diplomacy. So, either way, let us know if you'd like us to track that project closely as it progresses. Now we'll begin with what we'll broadly describe as the positive diplomacy, the process of making contact, establishing channels for dialogue, and building bridges toward a brighter future for the Syrian people, whatever that may mean. These efforts have come largely from the nations described as the Global West, the same nations that have spent the last decade and more trying to pressure the Assad regime into changing its wartime course of action. Of all the nations of the Global West, none has quite the pull of the United States. And in America, dialogue with Syria's new leaders has been ongoing for at least a few days at the time of writing. Speaking on the 14th of December, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken confirmed that American officials have already made and kept up direct contact with the leaders of the group HTS, short for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. They led the rebel offensive that brought down Assad. Blinken and other US officials haven't yet revealed the details of their contacts, other than to state that some of that contact has been related to the fate of a missing American journalist named Austin Tice. But as Blinken made his remarks on a trip to Jordan following meetings with European, Arab, and Turkish leaders on Syria's future, he and his Jordanian counterpart detailed diplomatic efforts to get several world nations on the same page. Quoting from the Associated Press here, along with counterparts from 8 Arab nations and Turkey and senior officials from the European Union and United Nations, Blinken signed off on a set of principles meant to guide Syria's transition to a peaceful, non-sectarian, and inclusive country. Critically, Blinken specified that the US has been in contact with not just the representatives of HTS, but figures from other non-HTS groups that now hold power in Syria. Said Blinken during those same remarks, quoting again, "Our message to the Syrian people is this: we want them to succeed and we're prepared to help them do so." Across Europe, efforts to reopen diplomatic contact have generally followed America's lead. The United Kingdom announced on the 15th of December that it's had diplomatic contact with HTS, despite the group's terror classification in the UK, a similar situation to the US. A team of French diplomats has already been dispatched to the country, arriving on Tuesday the 17th to assess the situation there and, quote, mark France's willingness to support the Syrian people. Those diplomats will hold a number of meetings with unspecified leaders and report back to the French Foreign Ministry before the nation decides on a path forward. On the same day that the French team arrived in country, Germany announced that it would plan talks with HTS representatives with the intent to focus on the importance of a peaceful transition and the protection of minority communities. Berlin has been careful to emphasize its hesitance around HTS, but has noted that, quoting a spokesperson here, "As far as one could tell, they have acted prudently so far." Germany hosts about 1 million Syrian refugees, making the idea of return an important political issue in the nation, especially amidst its broader governmental turmoil right now. Spain has taken a more reserved approach, with the nation's foreign minister calling for, quote, several red lines to govern their engagement with HTS and other Syrian entities, while Italian leader Giorgia Meloni is in a bit of hot water, trying to explain her government's decision to appoint an ambassador to Syria before the fall of Assad this past July. Italy has indicated that it will open communications with the new Syrian government. On December the 17th, the European Union's foreign policy chief and Commission president jointly announced that the EU will reopen its delegation in Syria, increase humanitarian aid, and establish contacts with the new leadership. Like the US, European leaders have paid special rhetorical attention to the continued threat posed by the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and the importance of continuing efforts to ensure that the Islamic State cannot reconsolidate. Meanwhile, the nations of the Arab world have played their own active role in reaching out to Syria's new leaders. Collectively, a number of prominent foreign ministers in the region have signed on to a joint statement endorsing elections supervised by the United Nations and based on a new constitution that will have been, by that time, approved by the Syrian people. In joint statements with the US, many of those same ministers have emphasized the need for Syria's new government to not only be inclusive, but to go out of its way to protect and respect the rights of minorities while ensuring that it doesn't offer haven to terror organizations. Iraq's foreign minister has called special attention to the importance of avoiding a repeat of the Libya situation of the early and mid-2010s, when the country descended into a second and much more ruinous civil war after longtime dictator Muammar Gaddafi was ousted. The nation of Qatar has announced that it will finally reopen its Syrian embassy after 13 years with it closed and has offered its support as the Middle East's best-placed mediator nation to work with a range of sovereign and non-state groups. Saudi Arabia has confirmed ongoing contact with, quote, every stakeholder involved in Syria, while the United Arab Emirates, or UAE, have taken a more conservative approach, reportedly dealing with a good bit of suspicion over both Turkish influence and the role of political Islam in the country's new leadership. The UAE had, until a couple of weeks ago, been a leading advocate of the idea that it was time to reintegrate the Assad regime into the Arab world. But other than global superpowers like the US or China, there is perhaps no nation whose perspective on Syria is more important than Turkey. Syria's powerful foreign neighbor is known to have provided informal support to HTS prior to the fall of Assad, despite classifying HTS as a terror organization, and the nation both controls its own buffer zone on Syrian territory and backs another pre-liberation alternative government in the northwest. Turkey's leaders have called for the intentional and careful preservation of Syria's existing institutions rather than simply starting from scratch, and have called for the world to, quote, never allow terrorism to take advantage of the transition period. Statements like those by Turkey are difficult to pass when everyone from HTS to the Islamic State to Kurdish forces in Syria are classified as terrorists by the Turkish government, but other elements of Turkey's approach make its intentions a bit clearer. Turkey, like Qatar, quickly reopened its embassy in Damascus after HTS's victory, and it's gone a step further, with Turkish Defense Minister Yasir Güler openly offering that it would provide military training support to the new government if it's asked to do so. Turkey has advocated broadly for the idea that the new HTS-led coalition should be given a chance in office. At the same time, Güler and others have emphasized Turkey's focus on eliminating the Kurdish YPG, a group that is instrumental in the establishment and ongoing work of the Syrian Democratic Forces, the military wing of the Kurdish Autonomous Administration in north and east Syria, Rojava. Among the particular comments by Güler that have raised eyebrows, quoting here, In the new period, the PKK-YPG terrorist organization in Syria will be eliminated sooner or later. Members of the